Better lucky than dead. Part 2. From the northeast, aftershocks spread through the countryside. The army of giants, hungry and bloodthirsty, spread as far as the horizon. Amber drops of rain, blood-thick, covered the land as the horde tore across the mountainside, ripping apart everything in its path, setting fires, destroying any animals or humans unfortunate enough to cross their track, demolishing villages whole like a monstrous landslide. Only when they reached the northern forest's edge did the Lestrygonians slow, taking their time to gather before emerging from the overgrowth onto the plains of Paul Vale. The giants ripped trees from the soil, uprooting whole masses of wood. Great hands hefted the splintered trunks and tossed them through the air as long-range ballistics. Trees skipped and crashed across the land and exploded into sweeping fragments, huge splinters that impaled townsfolk without warning. Blood poured from a villager's body as a book fell from his hands. Giants and the War Against the Gods by Regis Cromround. Heavy and leather-bound, the volume thudded to the blood-sodden ground. Its pages fell open, soaking up its late owner's vital fluids, till only a short passage was left readable by the time the body above it went cold. At first tribal and nomadic, over time the giant race split into multiple civilizations. The Lestrygonians put down roots on the fringes of the cold northern regions. Their massive bodies let them adapt to the harsh environment. Not bright but ruthless, these barbarian hordes approached the city and organized. The half-man, half-beast creatures had long fought with each other as much as with outsiders, since long before the first of their kind settled in the region. United under Hirian Amer's rule, the giants set their eyes and their unquenchable bloodthirst on the surviving southern areas of the human continent. They crafted weapons of bones scavenged from their own fallen, fused organic materials with metal stitching, knitting armor from the tanned flesh and bones of smaller human animals. The Lestrygonians moved, spreading terror into the western and northern regions. A loud crack was followed by an explosion, and tree shards pierced the book, tearing apart the remaining pages. Vero surveyed the land from the top of the town gate, his eyes watering from the strain as he peered toward the edge of the woodlands. The Lestrygonian horde had set up an artillery line, using the trees as mortar rounds. That was a surprise. The thought of an organized giant army using conventional tactics gave the knight commander goosebumps. Turning his head to right and left, he set his hands on the shoulders of the two young guards.
You two go find your families. Do what you can to protect them and get out of the city.
Gratefully, the two young men hurried down from the platform to the vacant street. Leaping from the top of the barricade, Vera landed behind them and hastened toward the church to rally his men and send the priests to organize the evacuation. Giant screams came over the town walls. Mayor Rob Stein was expeditiously organizing the militiamen who remained, ordering them up onto the walls with their guns.
Citizens of Paul Vale, we need to buy time for the non-combatants to get out of the city and into the forest. Set a perimeter along the wall. You have permission to fire at will.
The soldiers grabbed as much ammunition as they could carry and climbed up as ordered. Branches swayed back and forth, tickling Hirian's cheeks. Reaching up irritated, the giant ripped a particularly flirtatious one off and threw it aside. Staring through the tree line, he searched the city's defenses for a weakness. Then, glancing both ways, he gave the signal to begin throwing captured villagers against the sturdy barricade. Hirian's voice carried throughout his commanders and sub-commanders.
Get the chargers ready.
His men nodded and handed down their orders. The weight of his crown sat heavily on the giant. Others who were hungry for his power, biting at his heels, surrounded him. Ignoring their staring eyes, he continued to gaze across the field, watching the reactions at the northern entrance of Paul Vale.
They look like children operating the wall, my king.
A smaller Lestrygonian, of a leaner breed, appeared from Hirian's blind side.
What of their reactions to our tactics?
Hirian said without shifting his focus.
The children at the wall look ready to shit themselves, but some calmer, armored soldiers are peering over the wall as well. What are your orders, sir?
I just sent out the lunatics. Let's see if they can create an opening we can exploit. Be prepared to take advantage of the situation. Your men are free to do as they wish. I want the city, not the people.
The athletically built giant left, disappearing again into Hirian's massive shadow. His muscles tensed as he prepared himself for the upcoming siege. At 9 feet, 7 inches, Hirian was an imposing physical specimen. Even among his kind, few had his presence. And his size did little to hamper his raw speed and agility. Ruling with fear and power, Hirian kept a firm grip upon his clan. He showed pleasure in his people's success, which earned him their respect. His gigantic temper was matched only by his affinity for manipulating the earth. One of only 4 Lestrygonians who could wield the elements, Hirian had proved himself, and won his clan's kingship. His ears caught word of schemes from the 3 that encircled him.
My hair is standing on end,
Hirian said, looking down at his forearm.
It sounds like my enemies are near.
He bent down, and, seizing a handful of mud and leaves, rubbed the damp sediment over his arms and chest to create insulation. Then he picked up his ox bone armor, and squeezed one arm and then the other inside, the mud letting his arms slide in easily. When he donned his chest piece, it added to his stature, even seemed alive as the warrior king gripped his bone and steel axe. He checked at the curved blade carefully for cracks, then loosely spun it in the air above him. His shoulder-length hair blew back behind his neck, and the thick scruff on his face gave him a look of maturity even though his young features showed no scars. His eyes showed his determination to lead his people to victory. Setting the axe against his shoulder, he ordered the attack. A thundering, hammering noise resounded, and the barricade shook.
Those are bodies. Those monsters are throwing bodies at the wall.
The militiaman vomited as he looked down at the mangled corpses of women and children plastered against the walls below. A lone shot was fired toward the forest line. The bullet traveled across the plain and struck a Lestrygonian just as the giant was winding up to toss another figure. The loud cry brought a sense of satisfaction to the shooter. Light fought its way slowly through the smoggy haze, illuminating the battle line for the militiamen. But as they sized up the giant army, fear overtook them. They found the hulking army watching them in turn, gathering information on their responses.
They are going to charge.
A voice called down from the wall. Ver gathered his Templars and headed out to reinforce the wall.
Grigory, have the men spread out?
The sturdy lieutenant answered.
Yes, sir.
Reginald, get up top with the militia. See if you can figure out a way to slow them down.
Reginald's mind was racing, and he calmed himself as he climbed up to the platform and looked over the wall. Below, he saw the mangled corpses. Raising his eyes, he confirmed what they'd heard exiting the church.
Knight Commander.
His voice carried easily down to Vera.
The creatures are using fear tactics and setting up a charge line. The bodies the enemy are using, they're from the previous village we passed through.
Something instinctual made him duck. A human head flew over the wall, skimming the crown of his helmet and activating the nano-armor that all paladins wear, the defensive shield doing little to stop him from being knocked off balance. A panicked voice rang out. "They're coming!" The colossal line pushed forward and then began moving, gaining momentum as the giants dipped their shoulders lower and leaned into their strides. They covered terrain quickly and crashed into the gates. The barrier fell with ease, throwing Reginald and the militiamen into the path of the marauding Lestrygonians. Screams died as bodies were crushed beneath the heavy feet of the invading force. Monstrous axes cut through the air. Rushing out of the church, Alfric paused to view the situation. Reginald tried to regain his balance as he was stomped and kicked to the side, his lanky body skidding across the road almost to the priest's feet. Leading the rest of the priests out, the bishop advanced holding his Bible and chanting curses at the giants, the priests under him doing the same.
Get down, you idiots!
Varus screamed.
Go help the mayor lead the people out.
The bishop ignored the knight commander and continued chanting. A large spear flashed across the battlefield, piercing the bishop, lifting him from his feet before pinning him to a brick building. Screams rang out as nearby townspeople succumbed to fear, and the remaining priests scattered, running out into the fields. One by one, each exploded as cleaving axes cleared the area. Gritting his teeth, Vera gave orders to his paladins.
Slow these beasts down. Do not fail the villagers.
He gripped his hammer tightly, filling it with his energy, and then slammed it headfirst into the ground. The area around the gate convulsed, shaking the balance of the monstrous creatures before him. Raising the hammer and swinging, he connected, landing a blow just below a giant's knee. Vera paused briefly as the giant crumpled forward before letting the full weight of the hammer's head come crashing down, crushing the giant's skull. Seeing Vera's effort, his men gathered themselves to do the same. Each man copying Vera's tactics, the group seized the momentum, and one by one, the first wave of giants was taken down. Stepping out of the shadows of the tree line, the Lestrygonian commander showed his face. Seeing his first wave push back, he didn't hesitate to send in the rest of his army, and the horde of mountainous men tore their way into the city.
Retreat! If you can't retreat, do what you can to slow them down.
His orders drowned out by the ghastly wails of the giant army, Vera prepared himself for the inevitable. He summoned every ounce of energy within himself, drawing as much radiation as he could into his hammer as he braced for a collision. With each passing second, his hammer charged up more. Turning his head, he watched his men giving up their lives to slow the giant's rampage. Then, rotating his whole body, he swung his hammer from his feet, his hips, and his shoulders, unleashing a massive blast of radiation. It exploded forward as the proud leader fell to his knees. Alfric rushed through the town, collecting everyone he could find. From a distance, he saw Vera fall to his knees, but unable to help, he turned back to keep looking for townsfolk to escort out of the city. As he did, a giant axe grazed his forehead. Blood flowed into his right eye. The giant's momentum had carried it deep into the town. Alfric dodged the second blow cleanly, creating enough space to run. Scared townsfolk fled back into their homes, locking doors, trying to ignore the screams from outside. He kept moving until he reached the far gate, where he led his band of survivors into the forest away from the crumbling city of Paulvale. Flickering lights struggled to illuminate a southern keep on the outskirts of Firenze lands. The cold brick did little to hold out the moisture. The dim, tight halls were littered with empty armor and mannequins decked out in antique military gear. The winding walkways all eventually led the main room where Lord Crisian Firenze, a descendant of Theodrix Firenze, was sorting through letters and information from his clan's spies.
My lord, we have received a missive from Cardinal Aubrey.
Looking puzzled, the lord reached a frail hand out.
Give it here.
The servant handed the letter over. Using a long fingernail to open the seal, Crisian pored over the parchment through dry, crimson eyes. Then raising his voice, he ordered the servant to call an emergency council of lords. The decision to send troops would take time. The lord began writing orders, hurrying his words, for the Firenze military to mobilize to the northern city of Paulvale. Folding the letter, he sealed it with wax before handing it to another servant.
Get this to the staff general immediately.
Stress wore quickly on the lord's aging body. He rushed out of his office and into the hall, his legs burning as they began to cramp up. Crisian Firenze had always been pale and sickly, and he lacked the physical stamina to move his body for extended periods of time. Without his family's trademark red hair, no one would have guessed he was a Firenze. The trade-off for his lack of physical gifts had been the opportunity to focus on manipulation and magic. Being ignored by the nobility, even his own family, had let him develop an extraordinary ability to read people by truly deciphering their words. At the door to the keep, another servant helped him into an oversized fur coat and into the cold, damp evening air. The lord pushed his tired legs further to propel himself into the carriage. The servant who helped him glanced reluctantly at the vehicle on his right, but knowing how scarce gas was, he held his tongue and shut the door, signaling the driver to take off. The horses raced into the cold night, drawing their lord toward the Firenze capital. A bright brownish sun roared high and strong above a trampled dying field, the blood-red sky tinting it to a strange hue. A growing army lay camped out along the river bank, and in the forest, birds still echoed screams of terror. Crows perched on wilted trees in a circle, mulling over the buffet of flesh spread across the ground. Across the river, a village burned slowly to the ground, great gusts of wind flinging ash from burning corpses and buildings into a storm of ash and fire. The dry air feeding the fire allowed it to spread, and the intensity of the flames grew, further fueling the blazing gusts. The air crackled with laughter as trees split open from the heat. A pack of oversized scavenging dogs made their way down a nearby hill, ripping the flesh from crushed bones. In the burning city center sat a second army, giant, mutated, half-beast soldiers feasting on the villagers' roasted flesh. Loud laughter and the sound of crunching bones were drowned out by the thundering celebration of an overwhelming victory and the filling of stomachs. Terrible screams echoed off the burning buildings as headless women and men were raped and children were dragged in chains to cages to be prepped for cooking. Flayed clergymen pinned to the church walls by giant spears still cried weakly as the last air from their lungs dissipated, their bodies bloodied, their hands still holding their books of faith. Pages that were once read to inspire now flew about the sky, drawn to the heat, sticking to cooking flesh. Alfric moved quietly through the city, gathering what people he could. The weight of his situation wore him down, draining his stamina, making it hard to keep his eyes open and his feet moving. He stopped quietly to scan the area for a path out. The deep cut above his right eye still dripped blood down his face, blurring his vision and coating his cheeks and lips. Finally, he fled into the darkness of the forest with the few children he'd found. Oaks and great redwood trees, alien to the surrounding lands, were scratched with small marks, guiding the group to a damp, moss-ridden cave.
"Ash from my mother's flesh is in my nose,"
said a sickly, wide-eyed child covered in blood and black soot.
"I can hear her screams."
The child curled into a ball, rocking and crying. As if a switch had been flipped, all the other exhausted children began doing the same, their young minds taking in a lesson about cruelty, the cost of sacrifice, and the pain of survival.
"What's your name?"
a boy asked the young, battle-hardened priest as he reached out to comfort him. Other children gravitated toward his warm, open arms.
I am Father Alfric.
The tired priest began to recite a prayer to calm the children.
I am your father. Lord, thou be your name.
Father Alfric Canis had only found 30 survivors as he raced through the city, dodging flames and starved, and raged giants. Of those 30, 10 were children. He stared out from the cave as a plump village woman limped her way over.
"You need to rest,"
she said.
"I'll tend to the children."
As the adults were finally able to take a breath, the weight of what they just survived began to fall on them. Images flooded their minds, causing each villager to experience extreme fatigue. Adrenaline and fear had been keeping them awake. Loud, long marching and the thunderous noise quaking through the forest had kept the children from shutting their eyes. A few hours after the first of them had reached the cave, complete silence fell as exhaustion finally took over, and everyone drifted off to sleep. Alfric jumped up from his bedroll he'd made of his coat to explosions, and the sour grunt of Lestragonian soldiers hitting the ground. Knight Commander Veru, smothered in blood, limped out of the trees, 3 wounded men following him. The Templars stunk of blood and body fluids. Stepping carefully over the dead giants' corpses, still wielding their hammers, the weary warriors entered the cave.
We survived another mess.
Veru dropped ass first to the ground. Another soldier accompanied him to the cold, wet rocks. Gregory Stainer, Veru's first lieutenant, was a survivor of the War of Abraham. Only slightly smaller in build than the Knight Commander, he'd fought his way up through the ranks. Gregory was a hard man to read. He showed little emotion in his face, but he showed great care for those who served with him and under him. Now he picked himself up off the ground and reached down to help his commander to his feet.
We barely got out of that one.
"But your plan worked, Father Alfric,"
a third added in a relieved tone. Lord Reginald Aubrey, brother to Cardinal Audrey Aubrey, was a tactical man. Generally assigned to logistics and strategy, he had been a last-minute addition to the convoy. Reginald, not losing in build to Gregory, was also adept with the hammer he carried. His short brown hair showed a fresh gash. Reginald's previous post had been as the 1st Battalion's strategist and advisor. The 3 men stood bloodied, exhausted and hungry. Alfric gestured into the cave.
You all need rest. There's no point in dying of exhaustion.
Alfric's attempt at humor brought dry smiles as the weary priest helped the soldiers out of their armor. The survivors who were still awake reheated the foraged root vegetable soup and coffee. At the break of dawn, sunlight leaked through the cave's cracks, reflecting off the damp rocks and water. Droplets from hanging moss had created a small pool of fresh water in a natural sink. The children's eyes, still filled with terror, gathered around the pool, taking turns washing their sorrowful faces. Tepid coffee sat atop the poorly maintained fire as Alfric tended to the wounded in the far reaches of the cave with medicine and prayers.
What are we going to do now, Father Alfric?
Looking thoughtful, Alfric smiled.
We are heading to an old Templar outpost. It was abandoned some time back, but there should still be supplies, fresh clothes, and weapons, and tall sturdy walls.
Using his war hammer as a crutch, the knight commander made his way to the priest.
Outpost Michael?
Usually full of vitality, he showed the wear and tear of his battles with the giants.
I thought that place was emptied.
Gregory added. It was. I was stationed there once, and I left something used for our situation. Something I am not supposed to have anymore.
Still weary from the night's events, Alfric and the Templars pushed themselves to lead the survivors to safety. Alfric gathered up the villagers and readied them for travel. The loud moans of Lestragonians resonated off the trees, driving a stake of fear through the children and freezing them in place. The tired priest focused on the moment, and bent down to speak to them.
You cannot let your fear swallow you. You must search within yourselves and find the strength to push on. To move forward. You are the last of your families. Your survival means everything.
Alfric did his best to motivate the children, but the fear had them in its clutches.
It was an okay speech. For a priest,
Commander Vera said with a smile. He stood up straight, and his presence seemed to grow. The commander breathed in and gave out a loud huff of air, gaining the children's attention. Then he turned his back and strode toward the cave entrance. Sensing his confidence, the surviving adults gathered themselves behind the commander. The children, their knees shaking, forced themselves to their feet.
This is how you break fear. Your words were fine, but they must sense the confidence behind them. These people need hope. They need a purpose if they are going to survive.
Alfric stood up straighter himself.
It's a good point. Though I am sure if I had armor that looked like that, they'd react to me too.
Vera looked down at Alfric with his giant smile.
Our armor is cool, isn't it? Notice the pearl white shine, the gold engraving. See how the armor fits our body, how it reacts to our thoughts. The nanomachines that infest the world have become one of a paladin's greatest defenses.
He raised a gauntlet hand to show the survivors how the armor worked. The durable metallic armor peeled back on its own, showing the commander's skin, and then grew itself back over his flesh. Then the thin coating of machines covered every inch of his body. Alfric interrupted.
So, your armor is just for fashion then?
Just for fashion?
Vera said, loud enough for the whole group to hear.
This is second-generation Aegis armor. Its defenses are powered by our own magnetic energy. The more power your body makes, the stronger your shield. We have a symbiotic relationship with our armor. The machines feed off our electric fields, and we reap the benefits. Our hammers are 6th-generation focus. They store the power we use to create miracles. With training, we can release all that energy in a single blow.
Focuses? I thought the church declared the technology used by the magisters to be sacrilege and illegal.
Moving closer to Alfric, Vera lowered his voice.
You know better than anyone that if something is of use, the bishops and cardinals will find a loophole and convince the masses it was their idea all along.
So, the politicians are still spinning their webs of lies to enthrall the people in the holy city?
Yep.
The two men exchanged smirks as they turned to preparing for the long hike ahead. As the group gathered for the short walk across the golden fields outside, the exhausted priest looked them over, doing his best to keep a brave demeanor. Remembering his training, he pushed his fear down, using it to heighten his senses and keep his mind sharp. Vera leaned on his mace, legs still weary from previous days' unending battles. Walking up to join Alfric, the man said,
"Let's go."
The dry fields were dyed black from crusted blood and the lack of moonlight. A pungent bouquet of rotting wood and maggot-filled corpses dominated the air. Alfric was skulking about the edge of the forest. Alfric spent the next 4 days navigating the women and children toward Outpost Michael, feeling lucky he had not lost any members of the group. He turned toward the shadowed horizon, where he could just glimpse the silhouette of watchtowers. Vera crept up behind the priest.
I can sense the darkness of this place. The pain and fear have left a strong imprint on the land.
Alfric peered out across the distance.
There are ferals about.
Vera nodded.
We cannot stay here. We have to make it to the fort.
I agree with you. But the ghouls in this area make those damn giant cannibals sound like puppies.
Either way, I will have Gregory and Reginald prepare the group to move through the high grass. Can you use miracles?
The Knight Commander asked.
If it comes to that, I can make do.
Vera nodded, then backed up and turned around in search of his subordinates. A ferocious cry crackled through the air, freezing Alfric and his party in place. The wind grew hot and sticky, and the stench of rotting flesh filled their nostrils. Ghouls moved through the woods, scavenging meat without care from the buffet of bodies. Loud howls answered. Giant wolves patrolled the area too, scattering the gray-skinned creatures but heightening the danger. The mutated fiends scurried about on all fours, finally claiming a bare spot 100 feet in front of the fort. They dragged their meals into the grassless area to feast. Cold, beautiful moon-colored eyes peered into the darkness across the field and focused on the group as the largest of the ghouls lowered its head slowly like a hunting beast animal. It sat still, its predatory instincts focused entirely on the travelers. Still canvassing the area, the massive wild fiend hid in the grass. Turning their scaly-skinned heads, the others watched the wolf pack at the edges of the forest. The alpha fiend let out a commanding grunt, and the weaker, malnourished ghouls drew back, waiting for their human prey to walk by. A great, crimson-furred wolf caught a whiff of the group of refugees trying to slip through the tree line. Their fear overwhelmed her senses, and she savored the taste on her tongue. Her giant ears perked up, and she slowly turned her head toward the forest, and stalked back in among the trees. Alfric dashed into the darkness, breathing calmly, scanning the area. Ducking low, the priest stopped abruptly, grabbed a handful of dirt, and threw it ahead of him, disorienting the searching creature. Then he jumped back, dodging to the side mid-flight and falling onto his right shoulder. Steaming hot breath blanketed the area. Seizing a fist-sized stone, Alfric threw it upward into the darkest shadows. A clunking sound came to his ears, and the feral screams of ghouls answered. Sniffing around, the scavenging creature caught the scent of Alfric's blood and leaped. Bulging eyes locked on, and the dry, scaly humanoid came crashing down on top of him. Gregory saw the ghoul leap at Alfric as he grabbed his hammer without thinking. Vera seized the young officer before he could move, pulling his lieutenant down to the ground with incredible strength, and slamming the butt of his hammer into his back.
Watch closely. Pause 0.5s.
Absorbing the pain in his back, Gregory fixed his eyes on the horizon, searching for signs of Alfric. Finally, his enhanced sight caught a swirl of dirt and dust. Alfric stood at the bottom of a small hollow, fending off the ghoul's attack. Raising his church-issued cross, he slammed it into the creature's claw, causing dark, sticky liquid to spill out. His hand ached from the blow, and the wood and gold of the cross splintered. He stabbed at the ghoul's right ankle with a flourish, wielding the broken cross like a dagger and slicing up its calf to the knee. The monster swiped at Alfric's head, but timing his movements, he dodged and rolled, aiming now for the left leg. He missed his target as the ghoul darted aside. Then it moved closer, its stench overpowering, and kicked Alfric in the chest. Stretching its arms out, the ghoul let out another hellish scream, calling for its brethren to join the fight. Alfric, taking the full force of the blow in his side, was flung back a few feet and slammed up against something solid. He'd lost a good amount of blood, and his consciousness started to fade. He woke abruptly to fire and the shrieks of ghouls running off into the darkness. Vera stood over him, heat radiating from his body, hammer raised in case the fiends decided to renew their attack. Relief washed over him as he caught his breath. Looking up, he saw that it was the side of the fort that had stopped him. The rest of the group hurried across the field and caught up.
Don't worry, the fire won't harm you.
Gregory turned to Vera with questions and asked,
What did we just see?
Gregory gazed down at the injured priest.
His wounds are healing on their own.
Not many know about this ability. It's called the gift of life. Elfric's body is blessed by God. He can summon up the strength he needs to fight his enemies. He has the ability to bring forth incredible power and speed, and summon forth that fire he wielded. Those secrets are only taught to elite paladins. He can use the natural magnetic field of his bodies to distort and alter the energy he produces.
Gregory frowned.
You're speaking about old myths, about the first Mada fight. How can any even use those abilities?
I don't know. It doesn't matter right now. We need to get him inside the fort.
Reginald arrived following the last of the group, who were watching Alfric.
I don't understand what's going on, but let's get inside and close the doors before our good fortune turns sour again.
Sounds of aggression and bloodlust filled the air as the ghouls regrouped, moving recklessly and bumping into each other. The ferals too snapped and clawed at each other as tensions grew in their pack, giving Alfric and his group the time they needed to get inside Outpost Michael.